I was pulling the warm cinnamon rolls out of the oven when my daughter Sarah told me I wasn't worth celebrating. It was Mother's Day morning. I am Olivia Harvey, 68 years old, a widow for 7 years, and a woman who appreciates the quiet rhythm of a Sunday. I had spent 2 hours preparing a brunch I thought we were sharing. The table was set for 3, myself, Sarah, and her husband Greg. The house smelled of vanilla and roasted coffee. I expected them at 10. Sarah walked through the front door at 11:15. She wore a tailored silk dress, her hair perfectly styled, holding a designer handbag that cost more than my first car. Greg was waiting in their running SUV outside. She didn't take off her sunglasses. She didn't look at the table. "I'm just here to grab the mail that got delivered here by mistake," Sarah muttered, shuffling through the envelopes on the entryway console. I set the baking sheet down on the stove. "I made brunch. You told me on Tuesday you were coming over." Sarah sighed, the heavy, exaggerated sigh of a teenager, though she was 32. "Mom, plans change. Greg's mother Beatrice booked a table at the Wellington. It's a Michelin-starred restaurant. I can't sit around eating homemade bread when we have a real reservation." "You could have called," I replied, my voice perfectly level. She rolled her eyes, finally turning to face me. "Look, Beatrice is accustomed to a certain lifestyle. My rich mother-in-law deserves a proper celebration today. You never did care about the finer things anyway. You're fine with just this." She waved a manicured hand dismissively at my kitchen, my home, my effort. Before I could form a response, she grabbed her envelopes and turned on her heel. The front door clicked shut behind her. I stood in the quiet kitchen, the heat from the oven warming my apron. I didn't cry. I just reached over and turned off the oven timer. I sat at the kitchen island alone, eating a cinnamon roll. It was delicious. Arthur, my late husband, used to say my baking could cure any bad mood. Today, however, it simply tasted like clarity. I poured myself a second cup of coffee and opened my tablet. I rarely use social media, mostly keeping an account to look at gardening groups and the occasional neighborhood update. But today, the algorithm pushed Sarah's profile right to the top of my feed. Uploaded 20 minutes ago. A photograph of Sarah, Greg, and Beatrice sitting at a sprawling table covered in crisp white linen. Beatrice wore a diamond necklace and a smug expression. Sarah leaned in close, holding a glass of champagne. The caption read, "Treating the most elegant woman I know to the Mother's Day. She truly deserves Happy Mother's Day to Beatrice." Some women just know how to appreciate the luxury of a good life. Hundreds of likes were already pouring in. Friends commenting on how generous Sarah and Greg were to treat Beatrice to such a lavish afternoon. I stared at the screen. I didn't feel a sudden rush of anger. Instead, a cold, sharp logic settled over me. Sarah and Greg were not wealthy. They lived in a beautiful house in the suburbs, drove expensive cars, and took lavish vacations. But I knew the exact foundation of that lifestyle. Me. When Arthur passed, he left me entirely comfortable. For the last 4 years, I had been quietly transferring $2,000 a month into Sarah's joint account to help with their temporary mortgage strain. Beyond that, Sarah carried a backup credit card tied directly to my primary account, supposedly for emergencies. I looked back at the photograph. The Wellington charged at least $200 a plate. I knew exactly which card was sitting inside Sarah's designer purse to cover that luxury bill. The realization wasn't painful. It was liberating. I closed the social media app. I had a lot of work to do. I did not call my daughter to yell. I did not leave a tearful voicemail demanding respect. Arguments only give people like Sarah oxygen, a chance to twist the narrative and play the victim. I prefer absolute silence. I opened my banking application on the tablet. The interface was simple numbers glowing back at me in stark black and white. First, I navigated to the recurring transfers. There it was, $2,000 to S. Harvey Miller. Next payment scheduled for the 1st of the month. I clicked the small trash can icon. A prompt asked if I was sure I wanted to delete this standing order. I pressed confirm. Next, I went to the credit card management tab. The secondary card issued in Sarah's name was active. I checked the recent pending transactions. Nothing from the Wellington yet, which meant they hadn't asked for the check. I clicked the button to lock the card, then navigated to the account settings and permanently removed her as an authorized user. The screen refreshed. Her access was gone. Finally, I picked up my phone. I didn't write a long, emotional paragraph. I didn't mention the cinnamon rolls or the disrespect. I typed exactly 2 sentences. The monthly transfers have been permanently canceled and your access to my credit card is revoked. Enjoy your luxury celebration. I hit send. I set the phone face down on the counter. The kitchen was completely silent. For 4 years, I had convinced myself that helping my daughter financially was my duty as a mother. I had ignored her snide comments, her constant prioritizing of Greg's family, and her blatant entitlement, all because I thought it would keep her close. But she wasn't close. She was just on the payroll. I picked up the plate of leftover rolls, grabbed a small tin foil container, and headed out the back door. It was a beautiful spring afternoon, and I had a neighbor to visit. Martha lived 3 houses down. She was a retired school teacher, 70 years old, with a laugh that could carry across the street, and a garden that put mine to shame. When I knocked on her back door, she answered wearing gardening gloves and a wide-brimmed straw hat. "Olivia, you brought the famous rolls?" Martha smiled, stripping off her gloves. We sat on her patio under the shade of a massive oak tree. Martha poured iced tea while I arranged the pastries on a plate. She knew me well enough to notice the slight shift in my posture, the lightness in my shoulders that hadn't been there yesterday. "Sarah didn't stay, did she?" Martha asked quietly, taking a sip of her tea. "She stayed for about 2 minutes," I replied, breaking off a piece of a roll. "Just long enough to tell me that Greg's mother deserved a luxury celebration and I didn't." Martha's eyebrows shot up. She set her glass down hard. "She actually said those words to your face. Olivia, tell me you finally did it." "I did." I nodded, watching a robin land on the bird bath. "I cut the cord. The monthly transfers are gone. The credit card is closed." I sent her a message and walked away. Martha leaned back in her chair and let out a long, satisfied exhale. "Good for you. Arthur would be proud. He always hated how much they took you for granted." We didn't dwell on it. We spent the next 2 hours talking about tomato yields, the upcoming neighborhood book club, and a trip to Italy we had been vaguely discussing for years. For the first time in a decade, I didn't feel the need to check my budget, to ensure I had enough left over to bail my daughter out of her next imaginary crisis. My money was mine again. Around 2 o'clock, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. The screen lit up with Sarah's name. I silenced it and slid it back into my pocket. "Trouble?" Martha asked. "Reality." I smiled. By the time I walked back to my house at 3 o'clock, my phone had vibrated 16 times. 10 missed calls from Sarah, 4 from Greg, 2 voicemails. A string of text messages lit up my notification screen. I didn't rush to read them. I took off my light jacket, washed my hands, and poured a fresh glass of water before finally sitting down at the kitchen island to look at the damage. The texts painted a very clear picture of a collapsing facade. 1:45 p.m. Sarah. Mom. What does that text mean? Are you joking? 1:52 p.m. Sarah. Answer your phone. The waiter just told Greg the card was declined. It's embarrassing us. 2:05 p.m. Sarah. Mom. Please. Beatrice is looking at us like we're crazy. Unlock the card right now. I'll pay you back 7:15 p.m. Sarah. You can't just cut off our mortgage help without warning. We have bills. Call me immediately. I listened to the first voicemail. It was Greg. His usually smooth, confident voice was tight with panic. Olivia, hi. Look, I don't know what Sarah said to you this morning, but blocking the card while we're at the table is completely out of line. We had to ask my mother to cover the bill. Do you know how humiliating that is? We need to talk about this so-called cancellation of the monthly transfers. You know, we rely on that. Call me. I deleted the voicemail. The sheer arrogance of it astounded me. He wasn't apologizing. He was lecturing me for failing to silently fund his ego. They had sat at a $200 a plate restaurant, intending to use my money to impress a woman who looked down on me, and now they were furious that the ATM had closed. I didn't reply. I put the phone on silent, grabbed a pair of pruning shears from the utility drawer, and went out to the front yard to tend to my hydrangeas. I knew exactly what was coming next. The silver SUV swerved into my driveway just past 4 o'clock, the tires crunching aggressively against the gravel. I didn't flinch. I carefully snipped a dead bloom from the hydrangea bush and placed it in my garden trug. Sarah practically threw herself out of the passenger seat before Greg even put the car in park. She stormed up the walkway. Her silk dress wrinkled her face, flushed, with a mixture of embarrassment and absolute fury. "What is wrong with you?" she yelled, not caring if the entire street heard her. "Do you have any idea what you just did to us?" I stood up, slowly, brushed a stray leaf from my gardening apron, and looked her directly in the eye. "I assume I forced you to pay for your own lunch." Greg jogged up behind her, holding his hands out in a placating gesture. "Olivia, let's go inside and discuss this reasonably. Causing a scene out here is unnecessary." "I am perfectly reasonable," I replied, standing my ground on the front path. "And I'm not going inside. You have exactly 3 minutes to tell me what you want before I turn the sprinkler system on." Sarah's mouth dropped open. "You humiliated me. Beatrice had to pay a $600 bill because your card declined." She looked at me like I was a beggar. "You are a beggar, Sarah," I stated calmly. The words hung in the air, heavy and true. "You drove here this morning, insulted my home, insulted me, and explicitly stated that Beatrice deserves the luxury I do not. So I adjusted my finances to match your reality. I am not the rich mother-in-law. Therefore, I will no longer fund her lifestyle. That money is for our mortgage." Sarah countered, her voice pitching higher. "That money was a temporary gift 4 years ago," I corrected her. "You chose to lease luxury cars and eat at Michelin-starred restaurants instead of taking over your own expenses. That ends today." Sarah stared at me, the anger in her eyes slowly cracking to reveal the genuine panic underneath. She looked back at Greg, waiting for him to fix it. "Olivia, you can't just cut us off." Greg stepped forward, trying to use his professional negotiating tone. "We have a lifestyle to maintain. Sarah's brand my network. We rely on a certain image. If you stop the transfers, we'll default on the house within 3 months. Then I suggest you sell the SUV." I pointed to the driveway. "Or perhaps Beatrice can cover your mortgage since she is accustomed to the finer things." "It was just a joke this morning." Sarah tried, her voice wavering. "I was just stressed. You know how Beatrice gets. I just wanted to impress her for Mother's Day. By using my credit card to pay for her meal and then posting online about how generous you are." I shook my head. "It wasn't a joke, Sarah. It was the truth. You respect her perceived wealth, and you view me as a resource. The resource is now dry." I turned, walked to the porch, and picked up a heavy cardboard box I had brought out of the garage an hour earlier. I carried it down the steps and dropped it at Greg's feet. It landed with a heavy thud. "What is this?" Sarah demanded. "Your old mail, the winter coats you leave in my hall closet because you don't have space and the spare key to this house," I said. I had the locks changed at noon. That was the moment the reality truly hit her. I wasn't throwing a tantrum. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I was permanently closing the door on the dynamic we had lived in for years. "You changed the locks," Sarah whispered, staring at the box. You don't live here anymore," I replied, "and neither does your emergency fund." Greg ran a hand over his face, dropping the calm negotiator act. "Look, you don't understand." He snapped, his frustration boiling over. "My mother doesn't have money. Beatrice is broke. My father left her with nothing but debt. She just likes to pretend she's still high society." I stopped and looked at him. The sheer absurdity of the situation almost made me laugh. "Excuse me." She demands these dinners, these outings, because she wants to keep up appearances with her friends. Greg admitted, his face turning red. "We use your card to pay for it so she doesn't know we're struggling and so she can feel rich for a few hours. If you cut us off, she'll find out we're completely underwater." I looked from Greg to Sarah. My daughter was staring at the ground, refusing to meet my eyes. They had been draining my savings, disrespecting my home, and treating me like an afterthought, all to fund a theatrical performance for a woman who was faking her own wealth. "So," I summarized slowly, letting every word land, "you insulted me to my face this morning, praising a woman for a luxury lifestyle that I was secretly paying for." Neither of them spoke. The silence was absolute. "That is the most pathetic thing I have ever heard," I said. I felt no pity, only a deep, abiding relief that I had walked away from this circus. "Your financial lies are your own problem, Greg. Sarah, you chose your priority this morning. You chose the illusion over your actual mother. I suggest you take your box and leave." Greg opened his mouth to argue, but I raised my hand. "Get off my property. If you ever come here again demanding money, I will simply call a towing company to remove that leased car from my driveway." Greg grabbed the box. Sarah turned away, her shoulders slumped. They walked back to the car in utter defeat. I listened to the engine start, watched them back out, and felt lighter than air. The next morning, the house felt entirely different. It didn't feel lonely, it felt exclusively mine. I woke up early, made a pot of coffee, and walked down the hall to the guest room. For years, this room had acted as Sarah's personal storage unit. Even though she had moved out a decade ago, her college textbooks, out-of-season designer clothes, and old furniture crowded the space. I used to keep it exactly as she liked it, thinking it made her feel welcome. Now, it just looked like cluttered entitlement. I spent the next 4 hours clearing it out. I folded the clothes into large donation bags. I boxed up the textbooks. I dragged the heavy, outdated vanity desk to the curb for bulk trash pickup. By noon, the room was empty, the hardwood floors gleaming in the sunlight. I decided I was going to paint the walls a soft sage green. I was going to move my sewing machine in here, set up a proper reading chair, and finally build the library Arthur and I had always talked about. I was reclaiming my square footage. At 1 o'clock, my phone chimed. A text from Sarah. "Mom, I'm sorry about yesterday. Greg is really stressed about the mortgage. Can we just sit down and figure out a payment plan? We really need the transfer this month. Please." Notice the structure of the apology. One sentence of vague regret, immediately followed by a demand for money. There was no realization of the emotional damage, only panic over the financial consequence. I didn't type out a long explanation. I didn't engage in a debate. I simply deleted the message and blocked her number on my phone. Then, I blocked Greg's number. I went into my email and set a filter to send any messages from them directly to a separate folder I would check only when I chose to. The boundary was absolute. 3 weeks later, I sat on Martha's patio, a travel brochure for Tuscany spread across the table between us. So September. Martha pointed at a picture of a vineyard. "The weather is perfect and we avoid the summer tourist trap." September is Perfect, I agreed, taking a sip of my iced tea. I had already checked my bank account. Without the $2,000 monthly drain funding, a first-class trip to Italy wasn't just a dream. It was comfortably within my budget. The transition hadn't required a dramatic legal battle or complex maneuvers. I hadn't needed to hire a professional to untangle my life from my daughter's greed. I simply needed to close my wallet and lock my front door. I heard through Martha, who still spoke to a few people in Sarah's neighborhood, that Greg had traded in his luxury SUV for a used sedan. Beatrice had supposedly thrown a massive fit when Sarah informed her that their weekly fine dining excursions were over. They were learning to live within their actual means, and it was a painful lesson. I felt no guilt. I had given them 4 years of a free ride. It was time they learned to drive themselves. I returned home that evening to my quiet, peaceful house. The sage green paint in the new library looked beautiful in the twilight. I sat in my new reading chair looking out the window at my garden. I didn't miss the chaos. I didn't miss the feeling of being used. Sometimes the most powerful thing a mother can do isn't to fight or to argue or to beg for respect. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop giving. When you remove your resources from people who do not value you, they are forced to face their own reflection. I am Olivia Harvey. I am not a rich mother-in-law, and I am not an ATM. I am just a woman enjoying her quiet evening exactly as I deserve. Thank you for listening to my story today. Remember, your peace is worth more than their approval. Take care of yourselves.